Star Trek, the motion picture, is all you'd expect, and more. The most surprising thing about it is what happens to the people. Kirk, McCoy, Scotty, Sulu, Uhura, Chekhov, Decker, Ilea, and Mr. Spock. The human adventure is just beginning. Star Trek, the motion picture, rated G.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pantheon Plus. My name is Jerome Cuson. We are going to be talking about and ranking yet another franchise. Originally, this space was going to be for the Fast and the Furious. However, after discussions back and forth, we decided that it would be much more fun to review another franchise instead. Basically, what we said is a lot of the Fast movies tend to be very similar, and especially the most recent, like 2 or 3, not the most interesting conversation. So we decided a better conversation would be about the Star Trek franchise, of which there are 13 movies, the biggest franchise that we will be discussing this month. To do this again, my co-host is, of course, Brian Gilbrain. Brian, we both agreed to discuss the Star Trek franchise, kind of a last-minute decision. Brian, are you ready to engage?
I am absolutely ready. And to speak on the Fast franchise, it's just, I was going through them and it just was like mind-numbing. And then I couldn't figure out where Charlize Theron came from. And she was in the movie for like an hour and a half at that point. So there was a lot of bad character writing that I guess we just avoided altogether. So this is much better for it. Plus, Jerome was texting me for like the last couple of weeks before this that he's been watching some of the Star Trek movies, and I was like, dude, we should just do that. So that's how we kind of came to the idea. And yeah, I've seen all the Star Trek movies so many times that I just love them to death, and most of them love them to death. But some of the bottom half we'll discuss in a bit.
So last year, I finally did it. I finally watched the original series. This summer, I watched the entire Next Generation, all 7 seasons, all 176 episodes. I've seen the movies multiple times, despite not having watched the TV shows. But I recently, because I completed a Next Generation rewatch, I also completed a rewatch of all the movies. So I saw Generations, Insurrection, Nemesis, and First Contact. I watched all 4 of those. Not necessarily in that order, but that is what we are going to be discussing. We will be discussing Star Trek, all 13 movies, the original crew, the Next Generation, and the Kelvin timeline. We will put that all together and discuss everything related to Star Trek and the Star Trek movies. Without any further ado, because there's so many, I want to get to the list as quickly as possible. Brian, are you ready to start our discussion? Any thoughts before we get into it?
Yeah, I'm also on kind of a watch for the first time of the original series, but my thing is I don't want it to like just be done and like I'm gonna blast through 3 seasons in like a month, which is totally possible. I'm stretching it over years, people. My plan is to finish season 2 at the end of this year. I started season 2 at the end of last year. My plan is to watch season 3 next year, and then the Next Generation over the next 10 years. Why? I want it to last, and I want it to last through a lifetime. And I want it to feel new when I watch it 10 years from now, because it will be new still. So that's kind of my thing. But I still have watched the movies multiple times. And I guess the shows have just made the movies that much better, which I probably should have watched the shows beforehand before. But I was a kid, and I just wanted to watch the movies because it was a shortened version of it. And here we are now with the list. And I'm ready to go. Who are you going to start with, or am I going to start?
You know what? I've let you start, so I'm going to start this time. All right, let's talk about a movie that was compromised by a writer's strike. I think, unfortunately, this is also directed by William Shatner. Leonard Nimoy is generally regarded as one of the better directors of Star Trek. He and Jonathan Frakes. Sadly, William Shatner's foray into the directing space turned out very poorly. A movie that was heavily compromised and is generally regarded as one of the worst Star Trek movies ever made. I am, of course, talking about Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which was originally supposed to be the last movie featuring the original cast, but the movie turned out so poorly that we got another one, which we will, of course, discuss later on in this podcast. So my number 13 choice is Star Trek, The Final Frontier. Just kind of a disaster all around. Nothing really memorable about this movie. The nice thing is that it is only 106 minutes, but it kind of feels longer. It's just not a very good movie, and I wish that, there was a lot of interesting things to say about it. You've got a solid supporting cast in starting with David Warner, who has done other Star Trek things since. But yeah, Star Trek V just doesn't work on a fundamental level. And yeah, it's a weird movie all around from start to finish. And yeah, I think this is easily the worst Star Trek movie that's ever been made.
Well, Star Trek V is certainly in my bottom 3, but my number 13 is Nemesis, and multiple watches still can't help this movie for me, even after finding out that Tom Hardy was the clone. I watched this originally, I think when I did my original run in 2008 when I was working at Blockbuster, just renting all the movies for the first time. And I watched this and I thought, well, that was kind of boring. And then, 2012, Dark Knight Rises, Bane. Tom Hardy, I find out, is the clone of Picard, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a second chance. The second time around, it's even more boring. I don't know if it's the cinematography on that desert planet that just looks so bland because they didn't enhance the colors; they just muted the colors, so the sand looks like yellow instead of a bright, vivid brown that a sand color should look like. You know me in colors, people. So, you got that going on. And then the plot's kind of like a revenge plot, which is fine. I like my revenge plots in Star Trek, but it just doesn't work for me. Even on multiple watches, I tried to like this the second time, especially with the data stuff and like, the data emphasis of it all on this movie. But, I love data from the other, specifically First Contact, but in this case, it's just, man, I don't know what it is. I think it's part of it's the cinematography. Even with Jerry Goldsmith, it still doesn't work for me. So that's my number 13.
Let's stay on Star Trek Nemesis because this is, in fact, my number 12 pick is Star Trek Nemesis. So it's good that that worked out. It's so funny to see Tom Hardy in this role because it's just so different from almost everything else he's done. In a lot of ways, almost unrecognizable just because he's clearly trying to match Patrick Stewart, both in terms of his accent, in terms of his look. But I think there's some really good moments in this movie. I think for me, what separates Final Frontier from Nemesis is I think Nemesis has a couple of good action scenes. I think there are some moments in here that are solid. And I think there's some emotional moments between the crew that I think work out. But ultimately, I think this movie doesn't work. And for me, I think it's exemplified by the death of Data. The death of Data is, like, you think about the way that other deaths are treated in this franchise, and we will certainly talk about the big one much later on in this podcast. But to me, the death of Data is supposed to be this really big deal. And it's barely given any sort of feelings at all. I don't know, man. It's just, you get in Star Trek 2, you get this really emotional speech from William Shatner, and it's just like one of the best things that's in any Star Trek movie. And here you get almost none of that. And Patrick Stewart is an incredible actor, and you've got him and you've got that crew that have been together for so long at this point. Again, 7 seasons, 4 movies. Like, they could do something with it, but they're just not allowed to. And it's so weird to me that Star Trek: The Next Generation, like, some of the deaths that have occurred just haven't been handled nearly as well as the original series. Yeah, that's my feelings on Nemesis. It is a 2-star classic. There's a lot of boring stuff going on in the second act as well. It's a movie that's over 2 hours, and I don't know. And in my view, if your Star Trek movie is over 2 hours, you're really not doing it right. So that is my number 12, Star Trek Nemesis.
My number 12 is Insurrection, and I don't know. The first time I watched this movie, I enjoyed it, but then the second time around, a couple years later, I just didn't enjoy it as much. And I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it does remind me of the movie Brazil. In the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam, they do that face stretching stuff, which is very disturbing, and they do almost the same kind of technique here with these aliens species in Insurrection, and they're the ones that were kind of like the oppressors of these people. So I dig the plot. It's just the execution. I don't know. Because Jonathan Frakes, I thought, did a great job with First Contact, but in this case, I don't know if he was just out of his league or it wasn't the right story for him to direct, or I don't know. But I do love the look of Murray Abraham in this movie with that face that he has and the way that they show him how his species is like, trying to stay young with their facial features and doing the most grotesque things with their face. And he's got to wear the makeup and he's acting with the makeup on. So credit to him. And there's a lot of actors in Star Trek that have to act with the makeup on, but I think he pulls it off very well, more so than a lot of the actors that have to wear the makeup in Star Trek do. So credit to him in that. But other than that, I wasn't feeling it as much. And even though I like the plot, and I think is this the one where they all get horny with each other on the ship?
There's definitely some of that specific.
And then Jonathan Frakes that shaves, and I think Jonathan Frakes looks much better shaved than he has with a beard.
I think this is your worst take maybe ever.
I don't know, something about him without that beard. He looks so much younger. I think
he looks way better with the beard, dude.
He looks too old. I don't know. I'm for the younger kind of look. I love a clean shaven Brian myself, so I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I prefer a clean shaven over a beard, so that's just my preference. But other than that, Insurrection is fun the first time around, but it's not really something you'd like put on your shelf. It's not on my shelf. It's not one of the Star Trek movies I own. I don't like go specifically and own an entire franchise. I'll go out of my way to not specifically own movies that I don't like. For example, Spider-Man 3, don't own it. I just have 1 and 2. So in this case, it's not something that I would own, but definitely worth a rental if possible. But definitely check out. I think the makeup job in this movie is really good, though.
I'm a little bit higher on Insurrection than you, so we will get to it. I will talk a little bit about my thoughts on it a little bit later. Let's talk about my number 11 choice, which is Star Trek, the motion picture. This is the first one. And again, I think this is a movie that has some really interesting moments, especially visually. Like, you can clearly see the influence of Star Wars. You can clearly see the influence of even Alien on this movie. But there's some drab colors in this movie. I know you're usually the person that talks about colors, but I cannot watch this movie and then watch the next movies and not realize just how there is a lack of color in the uniforms and in some of the designs. It's really cool to see the cast together again, a little bit older, but just this really doesn't work as a movie. And the fact that, again, we have another Star Trek movie that is over 2 hours long doesn't really work out. And this is just, I think, just like Nemesis, I think there are some moments that really work, but ultimately it's kind of a bore. And I usually hate calling movies just boring because I don't think that's good analysis, but there's a lot of inaction in this movie, amidst some of the really good visuals and some of the really good moments. But also, I think it's funny that in so many cases in these movies, it feels like they're constantly trying to replenish and replace with younger cast members. I'm thinking about Stephen Collins in this movie. I'm thinking about Kirstie Alley in the next movie, and it never works out. That is always amusing to me. So for me, Star Trek: The Motion Picture is my number 11 choice. And yeah, I know that there's like a critical reevaluation in this movie, and I just don't buy it. I just don't think this movie is very good at all. I think it is a bore, and you will never get me to change my opinion on that.
Okay, so my number 11 is Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, and it's not the worst Star Trek movie for me because actually I can rewatch this movie normally, but not enjoy it as much. It just feels like it's like, a good background movie, you know what I mean? Because there are some interesting concepts in here. Like let's not forget that like a lot of like Star Trek episodes from the OG series is all about exploring the unknown and going, beyond and going and exploring. This was like the heart of that, and they just, I guess it's the strike. The 88 writer strikes again, and that's what happens when you have to rely on William Shatner to finish a script, and just Look, I mean, that ending was just so ridiculous. I don't know. I was just expecting a much smarter ending to this movie, and it was not the ending I expected, and it was just so like, oh, it's an alien bad guy, and we're just gonna run away. The end. That was it. All that hype. So at least the first one had that mystery to it that kind of I feel like it paid off with the mystery. And this one, the mystery totally doesn't pay off. But at least we got Spock's brother, which I felt like, wow, this is such a contrast because I guess he's embracing more of the human side, which is cool. But again, it's just this plot is not that fully developed, and it sucks because it's clearly like they have some cool ideas here. It's just poorly developed, and then the fact that William Shatner's director doesn't necessarily help because he doesn't have that that experience. I mean, he's got TV directing experience at this point, right? But like, it's just I don't know. He should have gave it to someone else, like an actual like movie director with experience under his belt that can handle a production like this at a time when the writers were on strike. And having William Shatner finish the script is never a good idea. So there's a lot going on with this movie. But I can, I rewatched it in the background, when I was doing some work over the last December on some projects. So I can say that for sure. But Nemesis Insurrection, I can't like put those on in the background at work, but I could definitely put on Star Trek 5.
I mean, I think the problem is that it's an ego thing. Like William Shatner was miffed that Leonard Nimoy got to do 2 Star Trek movies, so he had to do his own. And you can clearly see why one of them is a good director and why one of them is maybe not such a good director. And yeah, I think for me, it's just Nemesis and Motion Picture have just enough good to where I could forgive some of the problems of them, even though I want to be clear, I don't think the movies are actually good. For me, the 5th one just doesn't have any of those memorable moments, even if some of the ideas in theory could be good, but they're just not. And my number 10, this is the first of the J.J. Abrams movies, Star Trek Into Darkness. I think this is a movie that is desperately trying to be Star Trek 2, and it fails miserably. I think just like the previous 2 movies that I've talked about, I think there's some cool moments, but when Benedict Cumberbatch, everybody saw this coming, and the Khan reveal just means absolutely nothing within the context of the movie itself because they have not established Khan. Like in Star Trek 2, Khan was established in the TV show, and now they're bringing him back. And it's a big deal. Like, it's one of the best Star Trek episodes ever, and now they're bringing him back for the movie, and it's just, like, it's a retelling of Moby Dick in a lot of ways, and it works so well. This is just not that. It's J.J. Abrams aping off another movie, something that he knows how to do really, really well, and it's kind of a massive fail. I haven't even gotten into the fact that the reverse of what they do here is they kill off, quote unquote, James T. Kirk in this case. And it's infuriating because at least with Star Trek 2, they really sell the idea that Spock is dead. Like, yes, he comes back at the end of the 3rd movie. He's a prominent part of the 4th movie and beyond. But in this case, like, they don't even have the temerity to have Kirk be dead. They have to bring him back. And it is infuriating to me that they just decided to ape off of Star Trek 2. So, Star Trek Into Darkness, I think it is above the other 3 movies for a reason. But just like with other J.J. Abrams projects, this one gets me a little bit worked up.
Okay, well, that's going to be interesting in about 15 minutes. So my number 10, Star Trek Generations. Now, the concept of this Nexus ribbon just kind of like, I don't know, it's very confusing because at least to these online debates that I've seen, whether or not that everything post the Nexus ribbon does not actually exist because it only exists in Picard's Nexus imagination world or something. You get what I'm saying? But if you go beyond that kind of crazy thinking, it's a fun plot. It's all about, digging or not letting go of the past. And I get that. And, Malcolm McDowell's in this and he does a good job. A little over the top sometimes, but I think he does a good job. I think Whoopi Goldberg is good in this. I think the mixing of the captains is good. But some of the plot in the middle just kind of like, I don't know. I feel like it starts really well. and then it just kind of sinks down a little bit until the whole Nexus thing picks up at the end. So that's kind of where I'm at on this movie. I felt like Patrick Stewart, he felt like he wasn't the star of this movie, which is a shame, but I get the whole concept of this, transition, handing over the baton kind of thing. So I get it, but unfortunately it took away the focus of Picard. But other than that, I mean, the ending, I don't know. As cheesy as the ending was, I got a tear from when the first time I watched it, and to play the original Captain music, and I marked out. So dun 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 dun. I love that theme. Love that to death. So they played it right when he died, and it all worked out. And the Nexus ribbon, whether you interpret it as, I don't know how you interpret it, to be honest, because I always make the joke that everything post that in Star Trek just doesn't exist because of the Nexus ribbon. So there you go. But a fun plot. It was a little different. And it does kind of explore, again, these mysterious objects in space that they have to go and figure out what's this unknown. And then it kind of leads to this obsession thing by Malcolm McDowell's character. I just didn't like also the transition of time. Like the beginning is like, it takes this big time jump. So I didn't really like that time jumping either. I wish it was kind of close together in time.
I'm a little bit higher on this one as well, and we will get to it in just a couple minutes. But I'm going to talk about my number 9 selection. My number 9 selection was your number 12, Star Trek Insurrection. So I think this is a movie that very much feels like an extended episode of the TV series, and I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are other movies that kind of feel like this, and I think this is probably the weakest of them. Like, this doesn't really feel cinematic. We're really on only one planet, and we're on the ship. I am not as big of a fan of F. Murray Abraham as you are. I think where this movie, works at times is just when the main cast is interacting with each other. I think there's a lot of really fun moments. I think this movie, more than any, kind of feels like an ensemble. I think a lot of the Next Generation movies feel like the Jean-Luc Picard show, and the other players are very much support. And I think this is the one movie where I think almost everybody gets something to do, and it's very refreshing, and that's what I like about this movie. I do like the idea that so much of this movie takes place during the daytime, but there is also some really janky CGI that takes place. I am also a fan of whenever Star Trek shows that the Federation, even though there is this utopia aspect to the world, I do love the fact that the Federation is still kind of incompetent. And the only reason that it works is because of people like Captain Picard. So I like this. I think Patrick Stewart is really good in this. We're going to talk about his best movie a little bit later, but I think Generations was a struggle. But I think every other movie, I think he's really, really good, and this is no exception. And again, I think this is probably the strongest outing for Riker, for Commander Troy as well. So yeah, my number 9 selection is Star Trek Insurrection.
Okay, so my number 9 is the original Star Trek the Motion Picture from '79. I've actually watched this movie like 3 times. I've even seen the director's cut. And look, I can honestly say, yes, I can easily cut a half an hour out of this movie, because if it's just visuals of the ship and them moving, you can easily cut that boring stuff out. I mean, that's at least 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of the movie of them just going into the Enterprise from the little mini ship. So I get that complaint for sure. The colors are definitely like, this looks like I don't know, a couple in their 40s to 50s in 1979 trying to host a disco party and have no idea what fashion is. That's what this looks like. And I'm glad they changed everything after this movie, because goddamn, like, even on the Blu-ray, even on the HD, I was hoping that they would brighten the colors a little bit, and some of the blues come out a little bit, but there's a lot of brown, and I'm just like, ugh. 70s and brown. I just think of stupid carpets and ugly carpets. I'm not really a fan of the color brown. It's just, I don't know. And then when they put this in this movie, you talk about how much I talk about colors, man. This was just the big thing that sticks out. But I think that the heart of this movie is what a lot at the heart of the original Star Trek show goes into, and that's the exploration of the unknown. And in this case, they have this giant unknown that's threatening every planet in its way. And it's just too long to get there is the issue. But I think at the heart of it, I think there's a better reveal here, like I said. So yeah, in terms of that, finding out that it was this satellite from the 70s, I get that kind of connection. Is why they did that. But overall, again, this is a movie that doesn't have a villain. And movies that don't have villains usually tend that line where it's like, okay, what are we going to do here? We don't have an antagonist. Who's going to be the antagonist of this movie? And then it's basically a journey. So again, it's that kind of that extended episode kind of feel, but it's like an extended episode of the original series. And we get this, I thought they did a good job with Spock in this movie, despite a lot of people's criticism of him being so like anti-emotional, even more so. But in this case, I think the older Spock gets, the more intelligent and less emotional he will get. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And the way he's evolved his character from the TV show into its first Star Trek movie. And that's kind of where I'm at on the first Star Trek movie.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these movies, it feels like we're kind of in the same ballpark, but maybe we just enjoy one thing or another. So for me, to me, I look at the bottom two movies as being kind of one tier. I look at kind of the next three as another. And for me, my number 8 choice, Star Trek Generations, is a bridge movie. Literally is a bridge movie from the original cast to the next generation. But for me, there's a lot of things about this movie I like. I think William Shatner's performance is really good. But in a way, it's kind of a negative thing because to me, the new star is the one. This is the Star Trek equivalent of Hulk Hogan versus The Rock from WrestleMania 18. You feel me on that?
Oh boy, here we go with the wrestling references. I'm loving it, but yes, I totally see that now.
Because William, here's the thing: Patrick Stewart's a really good actor. If you watch the finale of Star Trek: The Next Generation, All Good Things, if you watch that finale, you are going to think that Patrick Stewart should have been nominated for an Emmy, and his performance is so good. And then you watch this, and it's very underwhelming. It's profoundly disappointing. And you really see him elevate his game in the next movie that he's in. But this is just a huge disappointment. And I think some of it's in the writing, but I think some of it is in the fact that William Shatner is just outshining Patrick Stewart. And, I think people give William Shatner a lot of shit. I think some of it is unjustified. Does he overact sometimes? Yes, he does. But he also always comes across like a star. And I think that's the kind of thing that matters a lot. And again, the rest of the supporting cast doesn't really get a lot to do here. Malcolm McDowell's kind of all over the place. He's okay. I don't think he's particularly spectacular. And I disagree with the decision to kill Kirk. I get why they did it, but you didn't need to do it. Kirk could have just go live somewhere else in retirement, and we don't need to see him die, man. We just didn't need to see Captain Kirk die. And I am not the person that always believes that you have to protect all of them, but all these older actors and whatnot. But in this specific case, it feels wrong to this day that they killed Kirk. And I can see why people are trying to make it non-canon and look at the Nexus and all that stuff, but it's just a profoundly baffling decision. The moments with them in the Nexus, I think, work pretty well. This movie definitely feels cinematic. The design of the Enterprise looks really good. So yeah, there's definitely some positive things. So this movie is kind of in the middle for a reason.
For sure. Okay, so my number 8, Star Trek Beyond, and this is definitely, in my feel and opinion, the most different of the plots, because it's very it's not even almost like a Star Trek plot. I mean, there is the idea of this unknown entity out there on the planet that they're exploring, and it turns out to be that previous crew. And I like the twist, even though the twist is obvious. I liked it. I thought Simon Pegg's writing, kind of showed with some of the dialogue, and especially with the direction of his character, and kind of they gave him more to do as Scotty, more than most of the movies, actually. Probably the most in Star Trek 4, actually. So, I think the script was good. Justin Lin coming in was definitely a big change. I wasn't totally excited, but he definitely had a good feel with the action, and especially when the Enterprise crashed, I thought that was great. The look of this movie is very good. It's so sad though, because of course, a month before the movie came out, like Anton Yelchin died, and I remember being in Vegas that day. I think it was Money in the Bank or something like that. It might have been also Game 7 of Cleveland and Golden State. So I definitely remember that weekend for sure, and that was just one of those things to that weekend. And then a month later, the movie comes out, and of course, Leonard Nimoy died like a year before this. And yeah, just a lot of sadness around this movie, and it is like actually the last Star Trek movie to be produced. But I thought it was a solid effort, better than the bottom tier for sure in terms of like direction and writing and the visuals and all that kind of thing. And for me, this kind of works, even though it's kind of like the least Star Trek plot of the movies.
So it's funny that we said we were not going to review any Fast and Furious movies. The director of Star Trek Beyond, of course, is Justin Lin, and he is probably most famous for directing the best of the Fast and the Furious movies. And specifically, this movie is why he did not direct Fast 8. So maybe you could blame this movie for Fast 8 being as bad as it is. I think Justin Lin is really good at ensemble casts, as you would know, again, watching Fast and the Furious. So I think the ensemble here is really good. I think it sucks that this cast, I think this is a really good cast, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but I think J.J. Abrams always does a great job casting these movies, bringing together the right people, and I think it's tough. Like, this could have easily been just a complete botch, but Chris Pine is a really good James T. Kirk. He is not William Shatner, but I think he brings a lot of the same qualities. I look at just across the board, I think the casting is very good. Zachary Quinto is Spock. Carl Urban is Bones. Zoe Saldana is Uhura. Simon Pegg is Scotty. John Cho is Sulu. And you mentioned Anton Yelchin as Chekhov. Like, there's just some really good casting here across the board. And it just sucks that the second movie wasn't very good. And the third movie just didn't do very well financially. And I think the third movie didn't do financially well because the second movie wasn't that great. So I think this movie has a lot going against it, but this is my number 7 choice, and there's a lot of positive elements. This is definitely, like, Star Trek Generations for me is a 3-star movie. This is like a 3.5-star movie. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in it. It is right around the 2-hour mark, but I think they use the time really well. This is a movie that I would definitely like to rewatch in the very near future because it's been a while since I've seen it. I've seen it a couple times, but yeah, I think there's some really good stuff here. And it's not perfect, but I think this is a really solid Star Trek entry. And for me, my number, I would say 7, 6, and 5. They're just really solid Star Trek entries. They're not top of the line, but for me, these are above average movies.
Yeah, this is kind of where we're in agreement. I think this is like where the solid level of Star Trek movies are in our list right now. So my number 7 is Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock. I wasn't that high on this movie years ago. You know what I mean? Even though I had seen it on TV so many times. They played this on AMC so many times. And I'd always be like, I always remember, hey, it's Christopher Lloyd. Oh, there's Shatner's kid. He's about to die. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And then a year ago, when I was doing my rewatch, some of the older ones, I'm watching this, and I'm starting to text Jerome, and I don't know if it was the weed or just the feeling, but I was like, damn, man, why did they have to kill Kirk's kid? But then I just realized Kirk's character is a tragic character. So whether or not that he's in the Kelvin timeline or in this timeline, he's either going to lose his son or he's going to lose his dad before he's even born. So it's like this tragic thing that's always going to be inherent with Kirk. He dies in a tragic way in the regular timeline, right? So there's a lot of things going on with this Kirk character that, people, I don't know, just kind of overlook. And I feel like some of the tragic elements they overlook. They look at the heroic stuff, but they never look at the dark parts of his character. And I'd say this movie really, it's brutal when you see it on TV as a kid, you're just thinking, this dude got stabbed, whatever. But the way that he kind of dies and then the way that Kirk reacts to his death is just so brutal. It's just, I think it's one of his finest acting moments in the series, to be honest now. Because that moment is just so heartbreaking. And of course, as a kid, you don't really think about that. But as you grow older as an adult, it's just like, wow, that's one of the toughest moments a parent can ever live through. And he just found out that, he was, I guess he knew, but he was never in David's life, which they go over in 2. But in this case, in 3, it looked like they were on a way to establishing a relationship. And that's what really breaks your heart. So I think this movie does a great job telling that story. But some of the other elements are very like, hey, let's try to get a bar scene, like in Star Wars. So they kind of have a cantina scene in this movie. There's a lot of fun at the beginning. I just kind of felt like we need, like, I don't know, the Klingons as the bad guys. They seem like really low in the totem pole of the Klingon Empire, and I thought maybe there should have been more stakes involved, so to speak, not just a bunch of rogue Klingons trying to steal the Genesis weapon or whatever. But and also the Genesis planet itself is so controversial, like this idea that we can just go out there and create new planets because we have the government authority, and if you're not part of the starship or the Starfleet, you can't do that. So there's some really controversial like ethics stuff going on in this movie that they go over, and by the end of the movie, the planet's so unstable anyway that I guess it doesn't matter. But in a way, that's great, because if there was a Genesis weapon that can create a planet like that, our solar system would be so fucked and just so territorialized that I think it would just cause so much destruction of the galaxy. So in essence, I'm glad that it ends that way. But overall, I think this movie is pretty good as it grows. It grows on you. And especially for me, when I watched it as a kid, I didn't appreciate it enough.
Speaking of the Klingon Empire, I will get to Star Trek 3 momentarily, but first I want to talk about my number 6 choice, which is Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, which is so much better as a final Star Trek movie for the original cast. And I gotta say, I think there's some really good supporting casts. This one is at the top of the list in terms of supporting casts. When you've got Mark Leonard as Sarek, you've got David Warner in this movie, you've got Kurtwood Smith, you've got Michael Dorn in this movie playing a different Klingon as well. So a really solid supporting cast. Christopher Plummer, of course, as General Chang. And yeah, I think this is a very well done movie. I think you could really feel the cast is a little old a little long in the tooth. And I'm glad that they ended it at this point. This really feels like a much more appropriate ending. No Leonard Nimoy direction, no direction from William Shatner. They bring in Nicholas Meyer, who directed Star Trek II. Also a really good choice. Kind of a historic movie in that you are getting peace between the Federation and the Klingons, which is a big deal in the context of this universe. And, it's so funny to me that, even in Star Trek Strange New World, there was a recent episode talking about like the war between the Federation and the Klingons. And, I don't want to spoil Strange New Worlds for those who may be catching up, but this is definitely something that is played throughout the history of the franchise. And to see kind of a seminal moment in the relationship, this is just a very appropriate ending because of the fact that two things, this is the end for the original cast, but also you're kind of paying off this war, this conflict that has existed for so long in this universe.
Okay, interesting, because I'm going to talk about that in about 5 minutes. My number 6 is Into Darkness. Now, I'm much higher on the J.J. Abrams 2 movies that he did than Jerome is. I don't know. I didn't care that it was trying to rip off Star Trek 2 because that's what I wanted. I just wanted like a modern Star Trek 2, and I got it. And I don't know. Just the fact that they got Peter Weller, man, RoboCop people. I thought he did a great job as like, obviously he's a bad guy in disguise, but I thought he played it off really well. And he is so good in that kind of like commander role that's kind of fooling Kirk. And, I was digging that. I was digging like this idea of like going beyond the border and what is Kirk willing to do for this, for the Starship Enterprise and Starfleet and all that stuff. And just like, what is he willing to do to cross that line? And, you find out about the missile and all that kind of thing, and how much is like the people in charge willing to cross that line just to get Khan, and why? And yeah, the big reveal of Khan, I know, but it was obviously him, and I didn't care. And I was like, I wanted him to be Khan. Great. Because this whole idea of what stems from Star Trek 1 is this is a completely different timeline because of what happened in the first one, because of that wormhole and destroying Spock's planet and killing Kirk's dad. That really changes things. Now, I've heard the criticism, Kirk wouldn't act this way. This isn't how William Shatner would act. This is not our Kirk. Kirk, from that timeline, had a father. The Kelvin timeline, this Kirk does not have a father. He grew up without a father. That's like a completely different human being. Imagine if Jim Cornette grew up with a dad. how much of a happier person and nicer person he probably would be. But he didn't, and look at him now. So I'm telling you, it's not this criticism. I think is just goes out the window because it's a completely different timeline and got completely set of different circumstances. Where one situation you have a happily, a happy kid with a dad, and the next timeline you don't have a happy kid with a dad. So this idea of a different Kirk totally works with me, and this idea that it screws up everything in the timeline. It makes total sense to me as well as to why that Khan looks different. You know what I mean? He's just, we've seen it in different movies at this point when it comes to multiple timelines and multiverses and stuff like that. Even with the Spider-Man movie we just reviewed, or we're about to review, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, they come back. So, and they look different than...
I don't mind the characters behaving differently. I just think if you're going to ape Star Trek 2, you have to earn it because it is generally regarded as one of the best movies, and I just don't think they earn the plot developments that happen. Again, if you want to do different things with the characters, like that to me is the whole purpose of doing a different timeline, is that you're going to explore different facets, you're going to do different things with the characters. So why are you just repeating beats from the second one, like in reverse? Like, do something completely different.
I have an answer for that too. Because if you remember, Star Trek 2009 drew in a completely different casual audience. That casual audience had no prior history to a lot of the Star Trek lore. And I know that because I went with a bunch of people that didn't even watch the show or anything or any of the movies, and they came out of that movie like, damn, that cast was sexy. Everyone looked hot. I can't wait for the next one. You get it? That's why they redid the plot line, because they felt like the casual audience that was watching Star Trek.
It's also because J.J. Abrams isn't very good at coming up with his own ideas. That's also...
So it's a win-win. For me, it's a win-win. So I like this movie a lot. I have this on Blu-ray. I profoundly
disagree with you on this.
I own this proudly on Blu-ray, and I enjoy it a lot. So there you go.
Yeah, we're gonna have some major J.J. Abrams conversations very soon, but we will be talking more about J.J. Abrams in a positive way, I would say, very soon. My number 5 movie is Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock. I love Christopher Lloyd in this movie, and I don't think you mentioned him, but I'm a huge fan of his, and also got Night Court's John Larroquette in a small role in this as well, which is pretty amusing to me. Star Trek 3, I think, is very good. I think it's kind of a step below Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 4, but this is one of the very few odd-numbered Star Treks that is actually good. So yeah, I am a fan of Star Trek 3 and just like what they're trying to do and the scramble and the Kirk losing his kid. You got a planet dying. There's a lot to this movie, and they really earn Spock's comeback. Like, when Spock is at the end of this movie in his Leonard Nimoy form, like, they really earn the fact that they brought him back. Like, it could have been very cheesy, it could have been really bad, but I feel like they earned this in a big way. So yeah, Star Trek 3 is really good. It's not quite as good. Like, for me, there is a clear delineation between even the top 4 and this movie. So, Brian, what is your number 5?
Okay, so now we're in my A tier, and it's Star Trek 6: The Undiscovered Country, and man, I love this movie a lot. Visually it's great. They have a lot of fun with the alien creatures in this movie, some transformation stuff going on. The plot is very, very good, and you mentioned how it's like a seminal plot now, or a plot point in history. Yeah, I think there's a lot going on with this. It's like a little bit of espionage, government conspiracies, governments going against each other, but in of course, in an alien race kind of way. And it's always been like that between the Klingons and the humans. So there's always been that tension that's always been there since like the debut episode of the Klingons and all that kind of thing, and always playing on that board. I remember that episode where they were like fighting each other on the border and nearly killed each other in the original series, man. And this was great. And Christopher Plummer, I thought, was great. And they had a little bit of like a little James Bondish stuff going on too when Kirk gets captured and that's the breakout. And he thinks he's like relying on his sex appeal charms when he's really just being used. And I thought that was funny. There's a lot of funny stuff in this movie. A lot of, positive elements that even Avengers would go on to kind of not rip off, but, emulate and pay homage to. I mean, you look at the end of this movie, it's like that signature from each member of the cast, right? They did that in Endgame. And the Romulan ale, right? What do I like? Superheroes getting drunk together. What do we got here? The Star Trek cast coming together, getting drunk with a bunch of Romulan ale and just getting loose and saying things they're probably not supposed to say. And I love that kind of stuff because it lets the characters, let their guard down, kind of explore the characters a little bit when they're not in their natural form. So I enjoyed those type of scenes. And this movie is just so enjoyable. I'm just so glad that Nicholas Meyer came back, because I think if Shatner tried to do this, it would have been a failure. I would not have felt as cinematic, felt as funny, and felt as heartfelt by the end. And everyone in the cast got a chance to shine. And I thought everyone was just on point. I thought this idea of an aging Kirk really was played out in this role. Like, it just felt like he was in that kind of like Danny Glover kind of role in Lethal Weapon 3, where it's like, I got to retire from this shit already. You know what I mean? So I thought this was a perfect way to end that cast and that series. And I thought it was a great transition to the next movie.
Always worth pointing out, William Shatner has the best choice in toupees. I just want to point that out. You almost forget, but he wears a rug on his head, and they always look incredible.
Why'd you have to break kayfabe like that? Oh, well.
I mean, because they look so like
it looks so natural. I didn't even think about it, is what I'm saying. But now that you mention it,
like, I have to mention it, as it is a tribute to William Shatner, because there's some people that wear toupees that look terrible, but William Shatner, like, this is a Pantheon level toupee performance throughout his entire career. I mean, Ted Danson also up there too, but this might be even more impressive.
Man, you had to mention Ted Danson, huh? Good old Sam Malone and his poof hair that seems to be too poofy at times, right? Even in the snow of Boston.
Yes, my number 4 movie. So I'm going to say some nice things about J.J. Abrams because I'm talking about Star Trek, the 2009 movie. I think this movie is a blast from beginning to end. I think this starts in just a kind of a what the fuck way, just straight up murdering Kirk's dad and just kind of putting James Kirk in the Luke Skywalker position. In a lot of ways, this is the best Star Wars story that J.J. Abrams has ever told, and he did it within the Star Trek universe. Again, I want to point out the casting is great. Again, it's one of those things. It's like, when you're recasting these roles, this could have been such a disaster, and this movie just nails the casting across the board in every individual role. I would even say, like, Christopher Pike. Bruce Greenwood as Christopher Pike, like, that's one of those things. Like, Pike is not as big of a deal in the original series, but that's great casting. Winona Ryder, Chris Hemsworth is Kirk's dad, like, just some really, really great stuff. And this is a movie that just has that really sings. I love the tension between Spock and Kirk. It's different. It feels fresh. Bringing in Leonard Nimoy, I think, was a great call to kind of bridge the two universes together. I kind of have this old man Spock advising the young Spock. Gives us a unique opportunity. And Star Trek has always done kind of the timey-wimey stuff. So, yeah, this is a tremendous kickoff to the franchise. And in many ways, they were never able to top it with either Star Trek Into Darkness or Star Trek Beyond. But this first entry was really, really good. I definitely agree that it did bring in a casual audience. It's just a shame that I don't think we ever got a proper follow-up to this one, because there was a lot of potential to really do some different things. And, I'm not sure if that ever realized the potential, but this was a really good start to this franchise. And also, Eric Bana, I think did a really good job of matching the energy of, like, a Christopher Lloyd as well, like, really hamming it up. So, yeah, props all around. I really like this movie a lot.
Okay, so now in my top 4, I realized, I guess I like all the time travel movies featuring Star Trek. So, number 4 is First Contact. My gosh. I mean, the concept of this movie is so good because it's like the first... I don't know. I want to say it's like the first horror attempt in the Star Trek movie franchise. I know there's been Borg episodes previously, obviously, with the big cliffhanger that I've heard of with Picard becoming a Borg. But in this case, it's like, wow, we're doing zombies in space? That's cool. And of course, I had not seen the show when I first watched this movie in 2008. So I'm just like, wow, this is like unique. And then you got the dual thing with the timeline shift and the Borg trying to go back in time and prevent Star Trek or the Starfleet from even happening, or the first contact between alien and man. So just like, there's this crazy time travel plot and a zombie plot, and it's very like cyberpunkish, I guess you'd call it, with the whole like Borg look. I don't know how you'd call that Borg look, but it's this Borg look. But the whole zombie look to them with the stuff in their face and the technology absorbing their bodies, like that is some really body horror level stuff. And there's like some crazy Japanese horror movies that are like that, where they go crazy with the body horror with metal. So it made me think of that. And so you're doing this like horror stuff, and it's like this family movie, but it works because the tone doesn't cross the line where it goes like, oh my God, that was like something graphic or something crazy like that when they were doing the horror stuff on the ship. The ship just kind of slowly became, overtaken, and I thought that was great. So there's a lot of great elements to this movie and the plot line. I thought Jonathan Frakes did a great job. It's just like, I don't know. I don't know if it was a quality drop or maybe just a certain script work with his directing style, and this worked. Maybe because it's the flashbacks and nostalgia, and he can kind of direct that kind of feel compared to a straight up, sci-fi movie that Insurrection is. This doesn't feel that way. It doesn't. I don't know. It's got this weird feeling to it, but I love it because it's got the mix of genres, and I thought the whole cast does a great job in this. And I really enjoyed the concept of this movie, and it really delivers.
This is my number 3. I agree with everything you just said. Patrick Stewart is unbelievable in this movie. This might be his best outing as Picard ever. This and All Good Things probably in my top 2 in terms of his individual performance. The thing that I love about this movie is that it immediately gets into the action. This is a 1 hour and 50-minute movie, but by 10 minutes, you've got the Borg, you've got the Awake crew is on the planet. I just love this movie from top to bottom. One of my complaints in watching the cliffhanger was, like, they clearly want the Borg to be like horror villains, and I think they kind of bastardized that in subsequent appearances. But here they bring it back to the idea of, okay, the Borg are just straight up trying to assimilate, and they don't care about anything else. And I think that's realized in a tremendous way. I love the Borg Queen. You get that alien element to some of this too, with some of the sequences on the ship. And you love the getting drunk scenes. Brian, this has the all-time great drunk scene with James Cromwell and Commander Troy. This might be one of the best drunk sequences of all time.
God, I forgot that too. And I forgot how great James Cromwell is, because I don't know. It feels also, you mentioned the timey-wimey of it. This has this Doctor Who plot kind of vibe to it, and it just works, man. And I think this just, I don't know. I don't think a lot of people have seen this movie compared to like 2 and 4, which we'll definitely talk about next, even 2009. But I don't even think they play this movie on TV enough in comparison to the other movies. So no, I don't know what it is.
This movie is underrated. Like if we did like an underrated sci-fi or underrated Star Trek month, like this to me would be at the top of the list, because I think this movie is incredibly underrated. And yeah, it just hums along at a really good pace. I think the performances are really good besides Patrick Stewart, but Patrick Stewart is clearly the standout. Also want to give a great shout out to Brett Spiner when he delivers his line, "Resistance is futile," as he turns babyface again. It's a great moment. It's a great hell yeah moment. And yeah, really good action. Really, this feels so cinematic in a lot of ways. And yeah, I don't know what happened with Insurrection, but Jonathan Frakes should have been able to direct something else, a big budget sci-fi movie of his own, because this is so good. First Contact rules. And that's all I have to say about it. What's your number 3?
2009 Star Trek. And man, when I saw this, I was just like, wow. Like, I thought it just connected with that modern audience we talked about. And like that beginning I felt was so emotionally charged that I was like, wait a minute, they're going to kill Captain Kirk's dad? I don't think his dad was dead from what I know. And then, of course, I look back and I realize, oh, they did a total timeline change, and that's why everything's so different. And look, you may not like the Beastie Boys in the Star Trek soundtrack, but timeline-wise, Beastie Boys is classical music for those people. Just like Elvis is about to be classical in about 30 years, folks. So get used to it. That's just kind of the way it is. And if you think of it that way, yeah, that makes total sense considering it's a couple hundred years in the future. Therefore, the Beastie Boys would definitely be called classical music to them. So that works out for me. I love the beginning, you know what I mean? Like I mentioned with the sacrifice, and I mean, goddamn, Thor, you know what I mean? Like you don't even think about it at the time because Thor was not a thing. And yeah, just for Hemsworth to play that role, I thought he did a tremendous job right at the beginning, because it shows you like where Kurt's heart comes from, and a lot of his personality comes from, just from that one scene alone at the beginning. And you see his wife take away baby Kirk, and like, oh my God, so emotionally charged. And then 30 minutes later, they keep that emotional charge going by destroying Spock's planet, Vulcan, and I'm just like, oh my God. And again, that's just a total game changer if you know the history of Star Trek. So, was watching just the first 7 movies before going into this movie, I was just like, wow, they really like went for it, and they went for the jugular, and they changed a lot of stuff, and it makes sense in terms of that when you got different characters doing different things now. So you mix all that together, and you mix it with the great casting. And listen, I was big into Heroes at the time, and I try to go past season 2 and think nothing of it, and 3 and 4, and I was just wasting my time. But Zachary Quinto, man, as Spock, I thought was like the perfect casting out of all the casting in this movie, even more so than Chris Pine as Kirk. So I thought that just works so well, the way his ears kind of just had that natural look to him anyway, and he has that look to him as being like that kind of Vulcan kind of look. So again, I think you mentioned the casting. I think this is one of the best castings ever in a movie. Credit to J.J. Abrams for putting it together. Yeah, I love this movie to death, and I've seen this movie so many times. I enjoyed it every time, and especially it's just like the way that Kirk kind of takes over the ship. It's like he has to dig even further back now from the situation. He has like to dig out of the hole so much further deeper than it was, because he has no father now. So I thought that was a great change.
I also want to point out that Jerry Goldsmith does a tremendous job with the scores for every movie, making them feel distinct. Of course, wrote the theme that I would say is most closely associated with Star Trek at this point. But this movie has Michael Giacchino, for God's sakes, and he does a really good job as well, remixing the original theme, and just the music throughout is really good. So I wanted to give a shout out to Michael Giacchino as well.
Also, shout out to Winona Ryder, one of my childhood crushes, Spock's mom. There you go.
Yeah, just really tremendous stuff. Let's talk about my number 2 choice. Controversial, Brian. Are you ready? Is your number 2 the same as my number 2? That's what we need to find out.
We'll find out soon, because
Is it Star Trek 2? Is that your number 2?
No.
All right. So I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna take the leap here. I think Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 2 are easily the 2 best. I'm going to tell you why I like Star Trek 4 in a minute, but I want to praise Star Trek 2 first. Ricardo Montalban is incredible as Khan. I had watched this movie and I was impressed by it. Honestly, after watching the episode of Star Trek that he is in, then watching this, I'm all the more impressed by what he delivers. I just think he has such a great sense of this character. I think he brings the dread. I think he brings the sexiness. He just does a tremendous job. He is a great foil for William Shatner. Star Trek 2 has the best William Shatner acting moment of all time. The speech after Spock dies, like with him quivering, almost like completely ready to break down. It is unbelievable. I love the choice to keep Spock and Kirk separated for so much of the movie, and then for Spock to make the sacrifice that he does. It's really good stuff. I also want to point out Star Trek 2, I talk about the supporting cast. This is another outstanding supporting cast. The now late Kirstie Alley does a great job in her role. You've got Paul Winfield. I know you're a huge Paul Winfield fan. He is really excellent in this role. And all I'm going to say is Star Trek 2 is excellent. It is very, very good. There is one Star Trek movie that I think captures the spirit all the better, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay, so my number 2, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, the very first Star Trek anything I watched as a kid. And I'm glad I picked this one, and I picked it because the cover of the VHS looked kind of like modern, and I was like, what's going on here? This looks like modern times. I thought Star Trek was supposed to be in the future. I watched this movie, and I was just kind of like, wow, this is great fun. And every time I watch this movie, you find even more little things in the background or what someone's saying. just the concept of this movie is just basic time travel. We have to go back in time, take some whale with us, and take the whales back to our time because there's no whales. So in a way, it's got this environmental message, and you got this SeaWorld plot going on, which again is kind of a controversial subject within itself. If you watched that documentary Blackfish, and just the characters click so much better in this movie. It feels like, I don't know, it feels like the realization of like a lot of these characters, like Chekhov, and when he gets kidnapped, and then when he has to find the nuclear vessels, and that whole conversation with the interrogation guy. I don't know. In that moment, I had not loved that character more ever than that moment. You know what I mean? And that happens a lot because, like, you got Scotty, who I guess inadvertently told the guy who was inevitably going to create that glass anyway. He invented it or whatever. He showed him how to do it from the future. So you got this whole idea of who, was it the chicken or the egg situation? So I love that. But then it gives him so much more to play with in terms of this. Like I mentioned before, Scotty doesn't have a lot to do in the other movies except maybe 4 and Into Darkness. You know what I mean? So the
scene where he tries to use the computer is an all-timer.
Dude, I was just about to say that, and I was just like, dude, this is great. And not only is he just acting well, it's just like, even in that situation, if you go back in time, it's like you could tell he's thinking about these consequences as he's saying these things, like, well, maybe we should just give him the formula, or maybe we should just do this and not necessarily mess with the timeline. But you can tell, like, it's he takes these approaches, that character Scotty, he takes these approaches very seriously in his decision making. You know what I mean? And the fact that he built the whale containment thing in the Klingon ship, or bird of prey that they stole from the third one. Oh, and the continuity from the third one, like direct continuity from the third one, left right where the third one left off.
You can watch 2, 3, and 4, and there's connective tissue between those 3. It really does exist as an excellent trilogy overall.
Definitely, and man, just that, just seeing them go back in time and that hesitation, like, if we do this, like, we're going to change everything. And the fact that they kind of saved the whales and brought whale species to the modern era after they were extinct for, 200 years or whatever it was?
Absolutely absurd, and it shouldn't work, but it does.
And that kind of did that really inspire the Save the Whales movement? I don't know.
I don't know if it started before that. I don't know if it did, but my God. it's just the audacity to do this and to just go there. I don't know, man. Like, this movie should not work. And I think I respect this movie so much because it is not afraid to be funny. It is not afraid to have an environmental message, which I don't think enough movies do. Like, there's a Star Trek Next Generation episode that has an environmental message, and it is so poorly done. Oh, it's so bad. Specifically, there's an episode where warp drive, like, kind of destroys space and is destroying worlds, and it's just the most heavy-handed bullshit you've ever seen. This isn't heavy-handed. This is just, it's pure comedy almost, and just across the board. This is another movie where all of the characters kind of get something to do because they're divided up throughout the city of San Francisco. So you get these little moments with each character, and I love it, man. I love this movie so, so much. This is my favorite Star Trek movie of all time. And if you had asked me before I did a rewatch of the original cast movies last year, I probably would have had Star Trek number 2, The Wrath of Khan as my ultimate number 1. But rewatching this movie is a blast. It's just a pure blast.
We forgot to mention Catherine Hicks, for crying out loud, and I think she's like my favorite character that's not in the Star Trek movies of all of them. That's not part of the crew, if that makes sense.
I will say Alfre Woodard from First Contact is also up there. She is really good in First Contact. I should have mentioned her when we talked about First Contact, but she is probably number 1. Like, that movie probably has my number 1 and 2 favorites, and I would say that Catherine Hicks is like number 3, but I mean, she is really, really good here as well.
And the fact that they brought her back to the modern time and she just accepted it and joined in and just fit in so well, I thought was amazing.
I am so sad that we didn't get more from her. Like, I would have
loved. No, I would have. If she would have came back in 6, oh man, that would have been perfect.
Like, I want to know what's going on with her, man. Like, that's what I want to know.
I know there's so much there with that character that they left on the table, but I don't think they realized how good of a character she was because, again, what 20, 30 years later, the buzz is still around 2 more so than 4, correct?
I would say so. I think the general consensus is that 2 is the best Star Trek movie ever made. And in my mind, I think it's 4. I think, look, and again, I think 2 is really good. Like 2, I think, does everything you could want out of a follow-up. It is so much better paced than the first one. You've got a great villain. You've got a great supporting cast. You've got those great moments. You've got the ultimate sacrifice. You've got the great ending. I don't know, man. I really love 2, but for me, 4, especially on the most recent rewatch, stands out more than any other.
See, I think we had the switch because originally it was 4 for me, and then of course I did my watch of 1 through 5 at the end of last year, and
so
yeah.
Have I convinced you that number 4 is the best now?
I'm still going with 2 only because I think 2 actually has the better script, and I didn't pick up on the Moby Dick thing until recently in the last couple of years when looking up this movie and looking up all its facts and stuff. And then when you put it in that perspective, it's like, holy shit, that's smart because they never meet on screen, right? That's the whole thing that people don't realize, and then they realize is like Kirk and Khan, they never meet on screen, and that's kind of like the brilliance of it all. And that's what I just kind of like got out of that last watch when I watched it like 6 months ago. I was like, this is so much more sophisticated than I thought this movie was. I thought it was just a revenge plot. Essentially it is, but they kind of go deeper than that. And then some of the sci-fi elements were just really like dark and gritty, like that planet that they're on originally was like not even like that, right? It was a normal planet that got hit by something, and then it just became this desert planet because in the original show, they basically Khan is left there with his people, right? Or his wife to make his own kind of culture or whatever. And even Spock was like, I don't know if we should just let him do that and just let him do it. But little did they know that that planet was going to be fucked over years later, and now he blames Kirk for it. So there's that white whale of Moby Dick that we talked about. Man, I think the script in this movie is just so great because you mentioned that they keep Spock and Kirk away from each other, and then of course there's this other subplot too that Kirk's realizing that he's getting old, and that's one of the first times he's acknowledging that. And I think that's one of the more sophisticated adult turns of the series, and they don't mention that in 4. You know what I mean? It's all about fun in 4, and just let's have fun with the concept, which is great, and I love that. But in 2, I just felt like they dug deeper into more of the character, and where like it's this whole like, am I getting too old for this? What should I do? You know what I mean? Like, I need glasses now. I'm getting to the point where I need reading glasses. And they make jokes about that in the movie as well. So, and that kind of becomes like, one of those things that comes full circle with his old school reading glasses. So all that stuff, man, I really enjoy Kirk's character. And just that ending with Spock, man. But then, Star Trek 3 kind of like, oh shit, he's just coming back anyway. But, we mentioned when we talked about 3 that they build up to that moment and made it worth it.
While there is some inconsistency to this franchise, I do have to say that after talking about it, I really appreciate the journey of these movies, and I really hope that we can get a good Star Trek movie again. I don't know. I have conflicting feelings about it because I feel like with the way, just if you watch Strange Worlds, it really feels like you're watching a Star Trek movie every week, and I think they've done some incredible work on that show in terms of scale, in terms of individual character work, and kind of having the design and look of a J.J. Abrams while also feeling very close to the original. Yeah, if you're not watching Strange Worlds, I would strongly recommend that you do so. And that's kind of where I come down. But yeah, I'm really glad that we talked about these movies because they're so different from each other, and there is that inconsistent quality. But if you've ever watched a full Star Trek series, the episodes are really inconsistent. There's some really bad ones, but there's also some really good ones. There's also some weird ones, and I think that's part of the magic of Star Trek. That's part of the magic of having these 26 episode seasons. Like, yes, you're going to get some bad stuff, but you're also going to get some really, really good stuff too. So this is a perfect encapsulation of Star Trek as a franchise. But these movies are super, super enjoyable for the most part. And that's all I have to say. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just gonna take it slow, watching each series over the next 10 to 15 years of my life, and I'm gonna do it on purpose, slowly, because I want it to last. You know what I mean? I want that feeling to last and feel fresh and new. And I mean, I had just watched an OG episode. I forget what the one, but that's the one where Kurt and Spock go back in time, and then he falls in love with this woman, and it turns out if he falls in love with this woman, she won't die at a certain point, and certain things in history won't happen, and Hitler takes over. Stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if I just like Star Trek and time travel necessarily together, but I hate to say that my favorite movies are the ones featuring time travel, most of them. But yeah, I just think there's still ways to make a good Star Trek movie that doesn't involve time travel, and we've seen that obviously in First Contact, Star Trek 2. But I just hope the next movie doesn't involve time travel.
Yeah, I really like for them to find a way to not tell that story, and we'll see where it goes. Next week, we will be talking about the Mission Impossible franchise and there's some mixed bag stuff in there as well, but it'll definitely be a fun conversation as we get into the 7 Mission Impossible movies that have been made thus far. I know you're excited. I know you were excited to watch number 2 again, and we're going to have some more J.J. Abrams conversation next week as well. Hopefully, maybe there'll even be a payoff to that at some point. We'll see. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week. Make it so, Brian.
Hey, watch it, dumbass. Yeah, well, double dumbass on you.